agriculture is at least twice as effective in reducing poverty as that originating outside of agriculture. But this is based on an agroecologic approach, or what Aldo Leopold called the land ethic, ecologic agriculture, where you embrace the full spectrum of living things and respect the importance of each component of the ecosystem in producing food for the human population. Sustainable intensification, meaning higher yields with fewer resources. There was a very interesting clinical trial carried out by Matthew Liebman at Iowa State, published a couple of months ago, in which he took conventional corn-bean rotation in Iowa in a study plot, and he compared it with a study plot, all the same characteristics. They held as constant as they could. And in the study plot, they put down corn, and then alfalfa, and then beans, soybeans, and then a small grain like oats or something like that, and then back to corn. And they did this over a 6 or 7 year period. They found that when they compared the total yield for both corn and soybeans, that the rotation approach was slightly diminished, but more than offset by a dramatic 40 to 45% decrease in synthetic inputs, both pesticides and fertilizers. So there are ways of restoring, regaining some of the methods of agriculture from the past and linking them with modern scientific understanding of crop yield to improve sustainable intensification. There needs to be reinvestment by governments and NGOs in the private sector. And Olivier emphasizes the importance of transparency, the very opposite of what we're seeing from Monsanto and DuPont today. That it needs to be free, it needs to be based on best practices, and it needs to be published in the open scientific literature. And finally, investing in women farmers. I'd already mentioned that 70% of the world's farmers are women. Only 2% of the landowners are women. So we've got to close that gap too. And then obvious things like improvements in infrastructure, roads to access markets, storage, refrigeration. And then this last one. So we're counting on Mark to lead the way, to figure out how to get people to decrease their meat consumption, which will then have this powerful ripple effect. We'll have greater access to iron and protein-rich food sources in the LDC. This is one problem area, because if we could give every child in sub-Saharan Africa 1 or 2 eggs a week for heme, lysine, and some of the other micronutrient zinc, that would be enormously beneficial while they catch up to have the full diversity of plants that are necessary to provide an adequate, safe, and nutritious diet. Well, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you. I think that this is a wonderful beginning of this morning, a renewal of all of the things that we need to be thinking about, and the insertion of so many new areas and so many different possibilities for us to consider and be deeply concerned about. So our concern, I think, needs to be focused. I think we've come across the idea that we need to have a sense of how to regain the strength of the knowledge, that is using the knowledge in a strong way to counterbalance the enormity of the system that has developed without any kind of brakes on it. In essence, we need a new level of responsibility that I think has to start with people. And the people in this room not only need to start a course for themselves, and they most have, adopting new things for yourself, But in addition to that, taking that message to the spiritual communities of the world and the message to the spiritual communities and the religious communities of the United States, and get an added benefit of the power of people all on the same wavelength to make a significant difference, because that's what it's going to take to overcome the kinds of problems that we see that are just running rampant. They're just moving ahead. As we talk here, as you well know, the Farm Bill is being bandied back and forth with these deletions of the SNAP program. But more than that, there are all kinds of passages in those multiple pages that are about stacked this high of what that Farm Bill contains that could alter the next 5 years. It's only decided every 5 years, and now it's going to be decided maybe right where we're here. People are meeting in Washington about what is going to finally be in there in the Senate version versus the House version, how they're going to finally get something passed, because they do need to, because it will technically run out in September. So there will be a hunger problem in September if we don't solve that. It will get solved, but the question is who's going to be cut out, what are the new passages, etc. So these are really important issues. We need to take the opportunity to be inspired, as we all are, by what you've had to say today, to begin to articulate a set of solutions that we can actually help with. And that's what our goal is to create a declaration from our conference that will be helpful to the large networks of people that each person in this room brings to the table and can bring away from this conference. So I'm hoping that that will be one of the major outcomes. I also recognize that there are a lot of people who would love to ask questions. So I'm going to start pouring coffee in the back. Here's what I'm going to do. Decaf and regular, mostly regular. And I'm going to pour it so that people would like to come through as they're getting questions, getting a cup of coffee. This one here, they can ask their question and know that they're going to get a drink of coffee along the way. But I don't want to take a moment away from any of the questions, because I think there's so many interesting themes that you've raised. I want to just have the line for them, and I will take orders of the people in line first for coffee. And how do you want it? Yeah, I think it should be one question per person. Question per person. Keep the comments. We don't want to hear a lot of comments, if you know what I mean. We want to hear a lot of questions. We've got a wonderful person to respond. Please do it that way.
Thank you very much for this. You mentioned that the 800-pound gorilla in the room is population. We do all these things, and it just contributes to the problem of uncontrolled population growth. Comment?
Yes. The Population Council in New York, after the last fertility survey, found that there were still in excess of 200 million couples around the world who wanted to limit family size but had no access to effective contraception. We have seen in many, many parts of the world where family size is reduced. Now, fertility rates in a place like Niger that are still at 7 or closer to 8, if they come down to 3 or 4, that would be a huge gain. We don't have to have everybody get to replacement level right away, but I think it's a question of transparency. It's a question of dealing with the fact that the Catholic Church continues to be the major barrier and obstacle to adequate family planning services being available worldwide.
And influence on policy.
And influence on policy, right.
focusing on the United States. Focusing on the United States and the issue of right to food, which has been a very consistent topic. What would it look like? Could you provide an example of how it would look in operation? I know there are probably various scenarios for how it would work, but just one idea so that I could have a vision of what a society in the United States that meets these goals of right to food, right to, what's the word, the insecurity, right to food security, I'm used to this terminology. How would it operate on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I would start with the distribution system and a country that has figured out how to get tobacco and alcohol and junk food into every nook and cranny of our country could surely figure out how to get quality, wholesome food to every nook and cranny. So we have a Baltimore City food map that defines, and now it's spread, we've mapped the entire state of Maryland. There are groups doing this in other parts of the country to identify the so-called food deserts, where low-income people living in slums have to either take 2 forms of public transportation requiring up to an hour of travel in order to get to a full-service grocery store. We could eliminate that immediately with income adjustment. It's a fiscal policy decision about the tax system, making the tax system fair, providing a minimum income level for all Americans, give them the purchasing power, and then the distribution system will respond. So that's where I would start. But it's probably starting with the most difficult thing of all, change our fiscal policy, given the current political moves. But that would be one area where we really could make a huge difference. Then some of the things that are already happening at the grassroots without much government assistance. There's been a tremendous growth in urban agriculture. Will Allen, Growing Power in Milwaukee, he took 23 million tons a year of food waste that was going into landfill and said to the city of Milwaukee, I will compost that, and I'll compost your tree trimmings and the other sources of carbon, and we'll use that compost to put gardens on top of abandoned parking lots, to build cloches. He's now employing over 100 otherwise unemployed inner-city youth in Milwaukee. Growing Power is extended to Chicago. We're beginning to talk to him about Baltimore. The similar program in Detroit, blocking on his name, a wonderful, charismatic local farmer who is leading urban agriculture restoration in a city that's now, of course, declared bankruptcy. But there are things like that happening at the grassroots that need to be encouraged with policy support. But the biggest issue is doing something about our income inequality and the maldistribution of good food.
I'm Valerie Briggs. Fascinating talk, thank you. I will phrase my comment as a question. You talked a lot about government failures, and it strikes me that government is also part of the solution in order to strengthen government's capabilities. And I think when we talk about the government failing us, it erodes our government capabilities. And truth be known, I'm a government employee. And so I think that what I heard you say was actually failures in our political system and failures in responding to corporate interests at the expense of individuals. And so I would just ask whether you and others in this audience can give that a little bit of thought as to when we use language like government is failing us, it actually erodes our capabilities to strengthen government's ability to do our job and provide services that Americans care for.
Thank you for that comment. I guess if, my topic was respect, protect, and fulfill, and I wanted to analyze the way in which, as the government, the United States government, our political system is failing the American people. And I'm personally persuaded that good government programs, I was a government employee when I worked for the Office of Economic Opportunity, they can make a profound difference, and we need to restore that. But right now, at the federal level at least, policies are contradictory, they're favoring corporate interests, they are accelerating through our current fiscal policies, the increasing income disparities. So how do you criticize something that you value without criticizing it?
It's not government that we're criticizing, it's corporate interests, government, and our failure to deal with this. And we as a political system are responsible for that, not just people up in Washington.
Absolutely. That's really the critical part. We need to throw the rascals out, and we need to get in good government. And there are places that do have good government. But when we look at the OECD and the US ranking on every important social value that all of us would embrace, we're doing a lousy job. We really are. We rank way down in terms of health outcomes. We rank way down in terms of income inequality. We rank way down in terms of maternity leave, preschool, child care, et cetera, et cetera. So, as somebody who thinks that government is a critically important partner with civil society, I just want our government to start behaving at a higher level. And some of my best friends are government employees.
I'm Stan Klein. Tomorrow at the talk shop is going to be a membership meeting, which is going to try to bring how can we as IRAS members do what Saul pointed out, bring it back to our community and to whatever churches or whatever we belong to. So that is going to be one of our, how do we achieve what our goals are? My question is, thank you so much for bringing up all the things you are doing. And one of the things that really shocked me and I think others was the fraction of the farm bill. Was it 60% that's going to 65% going to supplemental food?
Supplemental nutrition assistance program,
the SNAP program. So what is the problem? That sounds good. I was shocked about that. So is it not working? Can you say more about why is that 65% not doing what it should be doing?
Well, in many ways it is doing what it's supposed to be doing, but it's the target of those who, in response to Andrea's concern, who do want to shrink government, who want to shrink it until it can be drowned in a bathtub. So the problem with SNAP is that it is necessary given the amount of poverty in the United States and given the lack of food security. It does a very good job. There is a lot of tension, and maybe Ellen would be willing to comment on this. There are some of the hunger groups who feel that SNAP benefits should just be given with no restrictions except for alcohol and tobacco. There are others who are beginning to say, well, look, SNAP is a taxpayer-funded intervention to help people have adequate nutrition and be healthier. So therefore, maybe we should restrict sugar-sweetened beverages. We should restrict, and that's a big battle going on. And it has moral dimensions, and I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Ellen.
So,
Please identify yourself.
was also an issue that came up in our discussion of the nutrition situation. Sandra's wonderful opening talk on those issues. And there's been a constant battle between the anti-hunger community that is the community that mainly supports government legislation that will help people gain access.
Speak right in the mic, you'll be fine.
Get very close to the microphone.
Government legislation that will help people gain access to food, access to food with dignity, because now these are EBT benefits, so that it's not as obvious that people are fiddling with food stamps, and is considered to be more dignified. And these programs are also trying to have a greater nutrition component, where SNAP benefits now are increasingly accessible at farmers markets. They're trying to get people community-supported agriculture shares. They're trying to double up SNAP benefits at farmers markets. You get twice as much food for the given benefits in healthy fruits and vegetables. And this is the anti-hunger community's approach to this, but they don't want people. There's also a very strong contingent which says we don't want government somehow reducing people's dignity by telling them what they can or can't eat. So, and some of us are quite conflicted on those issues, because we feel that they're on the sugar issues, the sugar intake issues, the access to sugary beverages, and other kinds of unhealthy food intakes. We feel that there's a very strong business lobby that's trying to avoid any kinds of restrictions as well. So we're quite conflicted on that. And there's also the problem that in the schools, which is where a lot of the kids are eating these complementary foods that, again, Sandra talked about, they're eating these complementary foods, which are the high sugar, high fat foods. And these companies are helping the schools fund their discretionary programs in the era of lower funding for school extracurricular activities, or sometimes even basic facilities such as computer facilities. So there's that additional financial competition there. So the other component are the food banks that are getting donations of what are often unhealthy foods. What I see in the Boston area, the Greater Boston Food Bank has 2 full-paid nutritionists who are continually looking at those donations. They're classifying them, trying to help the food pantries and the soup kitchens select healthier foods. But that community also doesn't want to say no to business, because business is funding them. So it's this very tricky situation that we see not only in the government programs with what's the partnership with industry, but also in the private programs, what's the partnership with industry. So the solution is, I think, really to work much more closely with the corporate partners, as well as with those who are demanding the programs, to try to come up with a nutrition rationale. But maybe, Sandra, you want to say something else?
I'll just add that we now have gotten at least the right to do SNAP education, and to do education in a balanced way that we weren't allowed before to say there was anything bad about any food or anything not healthy. So we now have gotten the right to educate. I think that this is the convergence of the obesity, malnutrition, hunger world around what is healthy and how that intersects with people's rights, and to make a choice. You have to know that marketing is very pointed at children, and there's target marketing in disadvantaged communities with unhealthy foods. Sugared cereals is probably the most glaring example, but also sugared drinks. So I think that it's not a clean slate. There's not a level playing field, and it's not that these companies aren't target marketing susceptible populations. So I think this is where the discussion about unifying the obesity and the malnutrition and hunger world really is important.
Thank you.
My name is Pauline Kondo, and my question relates to reducing consumption of animal protein. My suspicion is that naming and shaming and blaming and taking a sort of moralistic high ground is not going to work. But do you agree with that? And how do you think the world might go about reducing consumption of animal protein?
Well, our emphasis at the Center for the Livable Future has been on the health consequences of a high meat diet. And just 6 weeks ago, a study was published from the Cleveland Clinic I shared this with Mark when we were talking last night. They took a group of regular meat eaters, a group of vegans, and a group of vegetarians, and recruited them to this study. They all came to the clinic in a fasting state and were fed an 8-ounce porterhouse steak, including the vegans and the vegetarians. And then at 1, 2, 3, 5, and 24-hour intervals, they took the blood sample. And they measured 2 things. One was carnitine. And carnitine is a short 3-carbon molecule that's present in red meat and in poultry. And it's the primary fuel for a group of intestinal bacteria that produce as the main metabolite trimethylamine N oxide, or TMAO. TMAO has been identified recently as the factor that causes injury to the cardiovascular system. It actually injures endothelium and then allows the injured endothelium to take up cholesterol and form plaque and atherosclerotic disease. So when they looked at the 3 groups, all 3 had a little bump in carnitine in their blood. It followed a similar pharmacokinetic curve, but only the regular meat eaters had a spike in trimethylamine N oxide. It barely rose at all in the vegans and the vegetarians. And the authors hypothesized that as we're learning more and more about the importance of our biome, that in the same way that the bugs in our gut interact with our immune system and do a lot of other things, that each of us has a kind of a signature collection of bugs, and that that signature is influenced by the environment, and the environment of regular meat eating increases the proportion of bacteria that are avid consumers of carnitine and producers of TMAO. So the challenge then is, how do you take a piece of scientific evidence like this, frame it in a way that's readily digestible by the general public, in a way that will influence their behavior, and say, whoa, so that's why I shouldn't eat so much meat. I think that's probably a better way. Where did Paul Gang go? I think that's probably a better way than climbing on a moral high horse, although animal welfare moves a lot of people. And I just shared with Mark that I read this morning an email from a colleague at Food and Water Watch that this year there were 11 different ag-gag rules introduced in state legislatures across the country, from California to Vermont. None of them passed, fortunately. And if you don't know about the ag-gag rules, this is to criminalize the kind of work that the Humane Society and others have done to document on film the horrible way in which industrial food animals are raised in factory farms.
Steve Finn, great talk. I was struck by your theme of intergenerational equity in conjunction with Sal's comments about putting the brakes on the current system and its problems. And I was just curious, that strikes me as a theme that most people can embrace, the thought of leaving a better world to our children. And so I'm curious as to whether that theme, or in your opinion, what theme or themes would be the most critical in terms of having success in creating a more sustainable food system?
Thanks for that question. I am puzzled by the fact that intergenerational equity gets such little attention. And I've talked with colleagues who are philosophers, who are theologians and economists, and usually it's the economists who immediately say, well, we all discount future benefits. And it appears as though we discount them at the rate of about 5% a year, irrespective of what the Fed prime rate is. So if you discounted 5% compounded annually, all future benefits disappear in 16 years. It's barely enough for one generation. So that's the economist's response to why intergenerational equity appears to have such little traction. But I also find that the message is most people who are most responsive to discussions of intergenerational equity are people who already are in caring relationships with their communities and with nature. You know, so it's almost as though if we could have the Koch brothers here and ask them about their grandchildren, you know, how would you like the world for your great-grandchildren to look like? What would you like it to look like? Would they say, oh God, I never thought of that? Probably not, but maybe. And I have a feeling that that's, for those of you who are philosophers and theologians, if you can figure out how to engage people in intergenerational equity concerns, that might end up being a really powerful driver. It certainly is in my own behavior. I worry a lot about my grandchildren. But then I worry about my friends and colleagues. And so I'm not sure whether it's a unique attribute or whether it's just a part of when you're concerned about nature and the world and the ecosystem, you start worrying about future generations. I don't know, does that?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
My name is Pam Morris. First of all, I wanted to thank you for your talk. To present so many of the problems but still have the humanity in it is hard to do, so I appreciate that. Just trying to get right to the point without the discussion part. The idea that if you teach someone to fish, they eat a lifetime. If you give them a fish, they eat for a day. And then the problems with actually having people of today's mind being able to do a victory garden, because they don't know how to garden. In the Second World War, they knew how to do it. So how would Michelle Obama's, I think, heroic symbol of having a garden actually be able to be an idea that could be actually utilized so that people aren't insecure, they can grow their own food, they don't have to worry about a food desert and being on a bus for an hour, they can grow fresh food. But there's a huge gap in their education, their knowledge, and their will. So I guess start with the education. How can people have the truth, the information?
Well, that's a wonderful question. 5 years ago, Rabbi Nina Cardin, Senator Cardin's cousin, called me up and said, I have an idea that I want to come in and talk to you about. And she said that she thought that in her synagogue, there were a lot of concerned people, but they seemed disconnected from the natural world. And she wanted to initiate something that would allow them to express their stewardship in a really practical, hands-on way. So we started the Baltimore Food and Faith Initiative. And it just one of those wonderful coincidences. A young woman a few days later came saying that she had just moved to Baltimore with her husband, who was a postdoc at the medical school, and she was looking for part-time employment, and she was a gardener, and she was very involved in her own church. And I said to Angela White, I said, would you be interested in taking this idea that I was discussing with Nina Cardin? Why don't you contact her, see what comes out of it? We've now had 500, plus or minus a dozen, churches, parishes, mosques, synagogues in the greater Baltimore area participate in the Baltimore Food and Faith program, which is all about urban gardening, teaching people how to grow victory gardens. So World War II, as you probably know, 46% of all the fresh produce consumed by the civilian population in the United States was grown in victory gardens. 46%. So what an enormous impact that could make. we also happen to have, as a part-time doctoral student in our DRPH program, the woman at the EPA who's responsible for the brownfields program. So we got her involved in soil testing to be sure that there was no chromates and lead and all the other things, which are serious problems for urban America. And this has just taken off in ways that we never would have anticipated. And it's all education at the, while kneeling together in the soil and planting vegetables.
And that would probably help with some of the young girls that have the obesity problems too, with self-esteem. I mean, there's so many things that could be solved by that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mark Causing. It seems to me that one of the keys to solving a lot of the problems, and even partly addressing Pauline's question, is how can we shift subsidies, where subsidies go from like corn and soy, which generally goes to feed livestock, but also, of course, corn, as we'll see in the King Corn movie tonight, gets turned into the high fructose corn syrup, which we know causes obesity. The meat and that sort of thing causes obesity, and we would eat much less meat and do a lot less sugary drinks and all that if we paid the real cost for those. But of course, we're externalizing, the corporations are able to externalize those costs through our subsidies of corn and soy and such. So how do we shift in a farm bill or some mechanism subsidies solely, the majority of them going to corn and soy, to maybe subsidizing healthier varieties of vegetables, maybe have a broccoli subsidy or a spinach subsidy?
Well, Mark, many of you have probably seen the slide of the cost of healthy foods versus unhealthy foods in constant dollars from 1990 to the present. And the cost of sugar-sweetened beverages, the cost of junk food, the cost of subsidized things that use a lot of high fructose corn syrup has steadily declined, while the cost of vegetables, whole fruits and vegetables has steadily increased. I would say that there's another externality that's not being addressed. It's not just the subsidy of commodities, but it's the failure to regulate. So if we truly captured, if we really applied the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, going back to 1970, then the way in which industrial food animal production is conducted would have to change. And so that's another, and that's a failure to protect, because that is clearly a regulatory opportunity for EPA that they've been unable to implement because of the power of the lobbying interests of corporate.
We would eat less meat if we
And
paid
we
the
would eat
real
less
cost for it.
Exactly.
The true cost for it.
What was that last comment?
Well, that we would eat less if the true cost. Although, price elasticity for food is not very great. It's a little tricky to count entirely on the cost of food to reduce the consumption of unhealthy foods, but it would certainly help.
Anita Spring, I really appreciate your emphasis on failure to protect. And so I want to ask a question that's in a way worlds apart, but I think very central to what's happening in the contemporary planet. Now, you mentioned China's imports of soybean as a way to save water on pig production. If I got that correctly. Yes. And Saul knows that I've been giving papers in the World Task Force on Food Hunger at the American Anthropological Association on land grabs, particularly by China, India, so a little bit about Korea in there as well, but particularly focused on China. And I've done research in several countries in Africa on their land grabs and what they're doing with the food that is produced. In other words, they're taking it back to China. And your maps, both of the water and the climate change, demonstrate that broad green thing over China, the tremendous droughts that China is experiencing in the central regions of the country. It is compensating for that by sending as many people, especially farmers, now to Africa. I'm finding them all over and in great numbers involved in an amazing array of agricultural production. And those container ships bringing the clothing and cheap household goods to Africa, for example, bringing back the agricultural commodities in both crops and livestock. So my question is about failure to protect American agriculture with very, very little cognizance on the part of people in Washington, perhaps, or maybe you can say the cognizance is there. What are people thinking about China's interest in commodities and taking them from all over the planet and for its own people? And how are we protecting the American people in terms of that particular scenario?
You're now pushing me outside of, well, I've been outside my area of expertise all morning, so that's, but you're really pushing me outside my area of expertise when you talk about international trade, because I just have found it so difficult to get my head around what we ought to have in the trade title of the Farm Bill. We had a wonderful preventive medicine resident who was herself originally from Sierra Leone spend 3 months with us in the Center for Livable Future a year and a half ago, leading up to the Farm Bill debate, drafting a white paper on what kind of trade policies could improve food security for the U.S., but also for, she was particularly concerned about Africa. So the problem you've identified is a very real one. I think the Smithfield sale is being challenged on just those grounds, that this is risking food security for the American people and adding to our environmental problems. But I think it goes well beyond that in terms of land grabs. You know, in western Tanzania, there was a group of very senior people in the Iowa State University Board of Regents and so forth, who were purchasing a huge tract of what was labeled as empty and undeveloped land, when in fact it had several 100,000 refugees from Rwanda living and farming there. Ethiopia, where chronic famine occurs, is now having huge tracts of land, as you probably are better informed than I. But I don't know whether we, short of getting the WTO to begin to apply the metric of food security to its decisions about trade agreements, that we're going to, if there's a continent with a net deficit of healthy calories, and that continent is being pushed into trade agreements that exacerbate the debt, it seems to me that that's worthy of taking up at the level of either the High Commissioner or et cetera.
Well, I certainly hope that because of the part on trade, there's going to be greater attention to it in the future, because I think it will have to make some inroads in the Farm Bill in order to get attention, and I think it's very worth getting attention.
There is one little event that happened in the last couple of weeks that some of you may have noticed. It was covered in the New York Times, and that was that the catfish industry in Mississippi and Arkansas is vehemently opposed to USDA setting up a new catfish inspection service. The inspection service has already cost $20 million. It has 4 employees, and it has not yet inspected a single catfish. And the annual operating expenses are estimated to be in the range of $3 to $4 million. The FDA already has a catfish inspection program that costs $700,000 a year and was responsible for monitoring all of the domestically produced and imported catfish. And the reason that the new additional USDA-based catfish inspection service was being proposed was that we're importing huge numbers of catfish from China and Vietnam, only inspecting less than 1% of them, all kinds of problems with contamination with drugs and various other things, similar to our shrimp supply. So there's growing awareness of the fact that our current method of monitoring inputs and outputs of our international food trade is not being handled well for the safety of the American people. And a lot of it is counterintuitive, like the example I gave of importing peaches from Thailand and so on.
David Laramie. Switching gears for a little bit, the U.S. food system and the U.S. energy system are now hopelessly intertwined. And as we try to move the energy system onto a more sustainable basis, the use of biofuels is just going to increase that intertwining even more. Energy use is also a wealth-related attribute that higher wealth people tend to use more energy than, say, a homeless person in New York City. Can you comment or think for me about how, in the future, as the policy for the right to food is also impacted by all the energy concerns, solar cell panels over arable land, and the biofuels, switchgrasses, and algae-based making impacts on both water and fuel, how is that going to make the drive for right to food more difficult or complicated?
It's certainly going to make it more complicated. I would say more algae, less corn would be a good thing. The largest installations of solar panels so far have been in desert areas that have not been crop producers, but I think you're right that the temptation to put them over arable land is going to be there. I think the real question in my mind is whether or not adding more biofuels, if we, let's say we suddenly had a way of growing vast amounts of algae that produce biodiesel, would that just encourage more diesel vehicles on the road? Given our current regulatory apparatus, the answer is probably yes. So it wouldn't really, it would appear to buy time, well, long range compounding the problem. That's what I would worry about. I think they have to, I think really sound transportation policy, energy policy, and biofuels have to go hand in hand. And we don't do that very well right now.
Thank you.
On the page, just a side comment, the animal use of antibiotic problem extends to the pet industry also.
It extends to
the pet industry.
Oh, yes.
My question pertains to genetic modifications, since we have enormous potentials, but the blueprint of the Roundup Ready program from the beginning looked to benefit nobody that wasn't named Monsanto. Nobody or nothing wasn't named Monsanto. My question is what the regulatory structure is regarding genetic modification, if any.
Well, right now the regulatory structure for fish is through FDA, and the giant salmon, you perhaps have followed that controversy, where they took the gene controlling growth hormone production in the pout fish and they inserted it into the salmon gene and produced a salmon that just, you know, pedal to the metal, full speed ahead, grows very quickly, seems to be a wonder fish until you begin thinking, what would happen with the escaped fish? What would happen with all the other unintended negative consequences that haven't been carefully thought through. Food safety of the giant salmon had been entirely performed by the giant salmon industry, I mean the backer. And a consortium of NGOs worked together, including one of my staff who runs our aquaculture project, and they were able to get the FDA to extend its comment period in those 60 days, which is just about to run out. The genetic modification of plants, however, is a USDA thing, and there's been very inadequate safety testing from the point of view of most people concerned about the potential unintended consequences. There was one recent study of pigs that had been in a controlled clinical experiment. One set of pigs were fed standard grain containing Roundup Ready soybeans and BT corn, and the control group was fed, or the intervention group, I'm not sure which is which in this situation, but was fed organic feed, not containing any GMO. And apparently at slaughter, an autopsy of a market-ready pig, about 11 or 12% will have gastric inflammation. And that was true in the control group, but in the group fed Monsanto Roundup Ready soybeans and the BT corn, it was closer to 30%. And there were a few other changes. The size of the uterus was different. So there are lingering concerns about the safety of some of these genetic modifications that may be acting in ways that a single gene theory doesn't quite capture.
Thank you. Senator Murphy, how is it possible, or is it possible, do you think, to have productive conversations with the food industry about shared governance?
10 or 11 years ago, we invited representatives of the Chain Restaurant Association, 52 of them, to a day-and-a-half conference at Johns Hopkins. And we said we're going to chunk it up this way. We're going to have a half a day on the science of the nutritional harms of fast food and the way in which animals are treated to produce all the hamburger meat that you sell and so forth. Half a day for open dialogue about how we could make the food system healthier, and then half a day for the chain restaurant people alone. There were 52 different companies that sent somebody. We were amazed. And the vice president for marketing of Wendy's was one of our contacts that helped us plan this, a man named Robert Langer. And I remember he came to the school a couple of months before the conference, and we were talking about the different challenges in my office, and he said, well, you know, our salad bar is 3% of our cost, and that's 4.5%. It's 3% of our sales, and it's 4.5% of our cost. Unless we turn that around, we're going to phase out the salad bar. So it's a little disingenuous, because your earlier comment about marketing, you know, Marion Nestle has written about $14 or $15 billion a year spent by the fast food industry, the beverage industry, and the candy industry to pursue